You hear the drums before you see them, a low, relentless thunder rolling across the open plain, steady as a heartbeat, and twice as cold. You scan the field ahead and your breath stops, because what is advancing toward you is not an army in the usual sense. It is a wall. A living, breathing, iron-tipped wall 8,000 men deep, bristling with 5-meter-long pikes tilted forward, like the teeth of some enormous beast that has never, not once in 100 years, known what it feels like to turn and run. The ground trembles beneath them. The air thickens with the smell of damp wool and iron, and somewhere behind that wall of approaching men, drums are still beating, rhythmic, ceremonial, almost contemptuous in their calm, as if victory has already been decided, and the battle is merely a formality. Before we go any further into what happened next, I genuinely want to know where in the world you're watching this from. The fact that a morning that unfolded over 500 years ago in a muddy field outside Milan still pulls people in from every continent absolutely fascinates me. Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Now, those drums, that wall of men. April 27th, 1522, on the grounds of an estate called Bicocca, just north of Milan, in the middle of a war that had already been burning for decades and showed no intention of stopping. Two empires, France under the Valois crown and the vast Habsburg dominion of Emperor Charles V, had been bleeding each other over the Duchy of Milan for so long that the conflict had taken on something almost personal. Milan was not simply a city. It was the lock on the door to all of Italy, the wealthiest and most strategically vital piece of land on the entire peninsula. Whoever held Milan held the peninsula's throat in their hands. And in the spring of 1522, after months of grueling march and countermarches, sieges and retreats, the French army under its commander, the Viscount of Lautrec, had finally maneuvered the outnumbered and cash-starved Imperial force into what looked, on any reasonable map, like a corner from which there was no escape. The French had every advantage: more men, fresher cavalry, and the most feared infantry on earth marching beneath their banners. What they did not have, and what would destroy them, was patience. The Imperial army defending Milan was a coalition of hard-bitten professionals drawn from across Charles V's enormous dominions, Spanish veterans whose sword arms bore the scars of campaigns in Naples and Navarre, German lance-skexed pikemen who would rather die than retreat, Italian men-at-arms who had grown old fighting the endless wars of the peninsula, and woven among all of them, in growing numbers, a new kind of soldier carrying a weapon that most of the European military establishment still regarded as a crude, unreliable, and frankly dishonorable curiosity, the matchlock arquebus. In command of this sprawling, underpaid, dangerously close to mutinous coalition stood the old Italian condottiere Prospero Colonna, a man who had not survived decades of Italian warfare by being reckless. He had survived by being patient, precise, and possessed of a gift for reading terrain the way a poet reads a verse, understanding what every rise and hollow and ditch could mean at the moment it mattered most. And somewhere between exhaustion and desperation, Colonna had found a piece of ground that he intended to turn into a killing machine. The estate of Bicocca, at first glance, seemed modest. It was not a fortress on a hill. It was not a mountain pass. It was farmland, low, flat, crisscrossed with drainage channels, and framed on its southern face by something that in any other context would have looked almost mundane, A sunken rural road, little more than a deep rut, worn into the earth by decades of cart traffic. But Colonna looked at that sunken road and did not see a path. He saw a moat. He saw a grave. In a matter of hours, his engineers deepened the cut into a genuine ditch, piling the excavated earth on the far side to create a rampart. Then he lined that rampart, from one end to the other, with his arquebusiers, Spanish soldiers, who had quietly become some of the most disciplined gunners in Europe, and German landsknechts who understood the geometry of defending from elevation. Artillery was positioned to anchor the flanks. The channels and boggy ground on either side of the estate were left deliberately uncrossed. Natural barriers that Colonna recognized would make a flanking cavalry charge a slow-motion catastrophe for whoever attempted it. When Lautrec's scouts returned with their reports, the picture was grim. Attacking Bicocca frontally was not a military option. It was a ritual sacrifice. Lautrec knew this. He said it plainly to his officers. His plan, the plan that had been slowly strangling the Imperial force, was elegant in its brutality. Wait. Keep denying them supplies. Keep forcing them to march and countermarch until their mercenaries, unpaid and furious, dissolved into the countryside, and Colonna's army simply ceased to exist without a single French soldier dying in a frontal assault. It was a correct strategy. It was working, and it was about to be torn apart by the most dangerous force on the 16th century battlefield. Not Spanish arquebusiers, not Imperial cavalry, but wounded Swiss pride. The Swiss mercenaries in Lautrec's army were the finest infantry Europe had ever produced, and they knew it with the specific, bone-deep certainty of men whose reputation had been tested and confirmed on 100 fields. Marat, Nancy, Ransom, names that still made enemy commanders lower their voices. Their pike squares were not merely tactical formations. They were a philosophy of war made flesh, the argument that disciplined mass and cold steel and the refusal to stop advancing would defeat any force on earth. They had been defeating cavalry charges for 3 generations. They had broken Spanish formations and Burgundian armies and Milanese city guards without suffering the kind of losses that lesser infantry took as routine. Their doctrine was ferociously simple. Advance always, never yield, take no prisoners, and above all, never, ever humiliate yourselves by standing still while a coward with a gunpowder tube takes pot shots at you from a distance. They despised the arquebus not merely as a tactical choice, but as a moral insult. And now, weeks into a campaign in which they had not been paid, in which they had been marched back and forth across Lombardy like pieces on a chessboard, in which their reputation for invincibility had been replaced by the indignity of an unfought war, the Swiss captains snapped. They assembled before Lautrec and delivered an ultimatum so breathtaking in its arrogance that even hardened veterans in the room reportedly went silent. They would be paid immediately, they said, or they would attack the Imperial position the next morning, alone, without the rest of the army, and then march home. There was no negotiation. There was no asking. There was only the iron certainty of men who had never considered the possibility that they could be stopped by anything a human hand could build. Lautrec reportedly stood very still for a long moment. He had no money. He knew what Bicocca was. He knew what waiting at the bottom of that ditch meant for any infantry, no matter how legendary. He begged. He reasoned. He warned them with the specific, measured language of a man trying to prevent a catastrophe he can see coming in perfect detail. The Swiss listened politely, and said nothing had changed. They would attack at dawn. What followed was the longest night in the Viscount of Lautrec's military career. He could not lose the Swiss. Without them, his army ceased to be formidable. He could not stop them. Their pride had become a force of nature that no French authority could redirect, and so he did the only thing left to him. He gave the order. At first light on the 27th of April, the French war machine would advance on Bicocca in one massive frontal assault. The Swiss would lead the center. The gendarmerie, France's elite heavy cavalry, the flower of the French nobility, would attempt the flanking maneuver through the boggy ground to the east, attempting to swing around behind the Imperial rampart. The rest of the infantry would follow in the second wave, ready to exploit the breach the Swiss were convinced they would rip open like cloth. The plan had a brutal simplicity to it. It also had the structural integrity of a house built on ice. Dawn came pale and cold over the Lombardy plain. The Swiss formed up their pike squares with the mechanical precision that came from decades of drilling, the long weapons rising like a forest of thin, deadly trees, the men behind them pressing forward with a collective weight that seemed to generate its own gravity. Their captains, among them some of the most celebrated soldiers in Europe, men whose names alone commanded fear, walked to the front of the formation. That was the Swiss way. The leaders went first into the fire, because anything else would have been incomprehensible to them. They advanced at a measured, grinding pace, drums rolling, not running, because they didn't need to run, because they were a geological force and geological forces don't hurry. On the rampart above the ditch, over 1,500 arquebusiers watched them come, resting their heavy barrels on their forked stands, match cords glowing, and said nothing. The order from the Marquis of Pescara, the Imperial cavalry commander, and one of the most gifted soldiers of his generation, was simple and absolute. Hold fire until the order comes, and when it comes, make every ball count. The Swiss entered the killing zone. The distance closed from 300 paces to 200 to 100. The men at the front of the Swiss columns could see individual Imperial soldiers on the rampart above them. They could see the glowing match cords. They could see the ditch opening up at their feet. And then the Marquis of Pescara gave the order, and the air itself seemed to break apart. 1,500 arquebuses fired in a single coordinated volley, a sound that was not like any sound that Field had heard before. Not the musical crash of swords, not the hiss of arrows, not the thunder of cavalry, but something industrial and absolute, a wall of noise that had no romance in it whatsoever. The lead balls struck the front ranks of the Swiss columns at nearly point-blank range, and the effect was not a wound or a loss or a setback. It was erasure. The first rank of the greatest infantry in the world simply ceased to stand. The captains who had walked to the front were among the first to fall. But the Swiss did not stop. That was the terrifying thing. They did not stop. The rear ranks flowed over the bodies of the fallen with the same grinding momentum. Drums still rolling, pikes still leveled, because stopping was not part of the doctrine, and the doctrine was all they had left. The Spanish and German arquebusiers, trained now in a revolutionary rotation system, in which rear ranks reloaded while front ranks fired, creating a near-continuous stream of fire, unleashed a second volley before the first smoke had cleared, and then a third. The air above the ditch filled with a choking black cloud that smelled of sulphur and burning linen, and through it the Swiss kept coming, men stepping over men, the square compressing as it took casualties, becoming denser and slower and more desperately exposed with every yard it advanced. When the survivors reached the ditch itself, they discovered the second dimension of Colonna's trap. The sunken road was deep enough to swallow them, and inside it their 5-meter pikes, the weapon that made them invincible on open ground, were too long to maneuver, too long to elevate, too long to do anything except clatter helplessly against the earthen walls, while Imperial soldiers on the rampart above fired directly down at them at a range that eliminated any possibility of missing. The ditch was not a tactical obstacle. It was a room with no ceiling and no exit, and the Swiss were trapped inside it. For the first time in the memory of any soldier alive, the Swiss pike square was not advancing. It was dying in place, and the dying had the terrible methodical quality of an execution rather than a battle. On the eastern flank, the gendarmerie had galloped into exactly the scenario Colonna had designed for them. The channels and bog ground broke their formation almost immediately. Armored war horses sinking knee-deep in mud, riders in full-plate armor struggling to stay mounted, the cohesion of their charge dissolving into a chaotic individual struggle for solid footing. The Imperial reserve cavalry, which Colonna had kept back with a patience that bordered on theatrical, chose exactly this moment to countercharge, falling not on a thundering shock formation, but on scattered, mud-slowed riders who had lost everything that made heavy cavalry dangerous. The gendarmerie, the cream of French chivalry, the men whose ancestors had ridden at Agincourt and Marignano, were pushed back in a rout that was more humiliation than defeat, retreating through the mud with none of the dignity they had arrived with. The battle lasted less than 30 minutes in its most violent phase. When the Swiss pike squares finally broke, when the survivors of those grinding, burning minutes finally turned, the first time in a generation that Swiss infantry had run from anything, the field they left behind was something that witnesses described in terms usually reserved for natural disasters. The ditch was filled with the dead. The ground in front of the rampart was carpeted with bodies so dense that later accounts said a man could walk from one side of the killing zone to the other without touching the earth. Among the dead were over 3,000 Swiss soldiers and nearly 24 of their captains. The professional corps of the finest infantry tradition in Europe, lost in a single morning because of the collision between a brilliant defensive mind and the catastrophic vanity of men who had convinced themselves that courage alone could nullify physics. The consequences of that April morning radiated outward across the European military world with the speed and force of the shot that had produced them. The French army, deprived of its Swiss infantry and its cavalry's morale, began the retreat from Lombardy almost immediately, abandoning the campaign Lautrec had spent a year carefully constructing. Colonna had not merely won a battle. He had ended a strategic season, secured the Duchy of Milan for the Emperor, and demonstrated something that would take most of Europe's commanders another generation to fully absorb, that a prepared defensive position, properly staffed with firearms, could not be overcome by raw courage and numerical superiority. The architecture of the battlefield had changed quietly and permanently behind the smoke of 1,500 arquebuses. The Swiss mercenary market did not collapse overnight. They remained valuable soldiers for decades, but the specific mystique, the aura of divine invincibility that had let Swiss captains dictate terms to kings, never fully reconstituted itself. They had been seen bleeding. They had been seen running. and no amount of subsequent competence could unsee that. For the Spanish commanders who had stood on that rampart, particularly the Marquis of Pescara and the officers around him who had watched the coordination between pikemen and arquebusiers, produced something that neither weapon could have achieved alone. Bicocca was not just a victory, it was a proof of concept, a working demonstration of a new arithmetic of war in which firepower, discipline, and defensive geometry could multiply each other into something greater than the sum of their parts. They would spend the next 3 years refining, drilling, and institutionalizing what they had witnessed, working toward a combined arms formation that would eventually be given a name, the Tercio. And 3 years later at Pavia, that formation would meet the French army again, capture its king, and announce to every court in Europe that the age of the Tercio had arrived. The seeds of Pavia were planted at Bicocca in a ditch on a morning when drums went suddenly silent. A single document survives from the Imperial camp, written in cramped Latin by a Spanish chaplain who witnessed the aftermath of the battle. He does not describe triumph. He writes about the silence after the guns stopped, a silence unlike any he had known, not empty but stunned, as if the air itself could not process what it had carried. The arquebusiers sat along the rampart and did not cheer. They stared into the ditch. They cleaned their weapons, slowly, deliberately, as if their hands required purpose. They had just broken the finest infantry in Europe, and the knowledge felt heavier than glory. History would call them revolutionaries. The chaplain recorded something smaller, men with sulphur in their clothes, watching smoke dissolve into a pale Lombard morning. At Bicocca, no king fell, no cavalry thundered. The Swiss did not lose to greater courage, but to a deeper road and a weapon they had mocked. Colonna saw the future in gunpowder. That vision changed an era.